When Darius Durant, a young postman, rang the doorbell to deliver a package along his usual route, he could never have anticipated the horror awaiting him. As the door creaked open, he was met with a nightmare. Mrs. Thompson, once the embodiment of suburban grace, now stood before him in shocking neglect. Her silver hair, once neatly styled, was now matted and greasy. Her clothes were stained and hung loosely on her frail frame, and her entire presence seemed like a faded shadow of her former self. As she swayed unsteadily in the doorway, Darius caught a glimpse inside her home, and what he saw sent a chill through his veins. In that heart-stopping instant, he knew he had to act. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching or listening from today. If this shocking story grabs your attention, don't forget to hit subscribe. The day had barely begun when Darius Durant's alarm clock shattered the pre-dawn stillness. With practiced efficiency, he rose, his movements automatic after years of the same routine. The cool morning air brushed against his skin as he made his way to the bathroom, splashing water on his face to banish the lingering remnants of sleep. Standing before the mirror, Darius took a moment to straighten his postal uniform, smoothing out the creases with care. The blue fabric, adorned with a familiar eagle logo, filled him with quiet pride, representing more than just a job. It symbolized his connection to the community he served. After grabbing a quick breakfast, a banana and a granola bar, Darius stepped out the door. The streets of Copper Hill were still asleep, the town not yet fully awake. He inhaled deeply, savoring the crisp morning air laced with the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. At the post office, Darius exchanged greetings with his coworkers, their pleasantries brief but warm as they prepared for the day. Collecting his bag of mail and the keys to his van, he mentally mapped out his route. Sliding into the driver's seat, he felt a sense of comfort in the familiar space. The worn steering wheel and faint aroma of paper and ink made the vehicle feel like a second home. As the engine hummed to life, it marked the beginning of the day's rhythm, a symphony of deliveries. Darius moved through the awakening town with practiced ease. Early risers waved as they retrieved their newspapers, dog walkers offered smiles, and joggers nodded in acknowledgement. These small exchanges, though fleeting, formed the backbone of his connection to Copper Hill. Each stop was a brief moment in time, a package handed over, a letter delivered, a few words exchanged with a familiar face. To Darius, these interactions were the threads that wove the fabric of his day, each one unique and meaningful. By mid-morning, Darius paused to sort his next batch of deliveries, leaning against his van as he flipped through letters and small packages. The routine was so ingrained that his hands seemed to work on their own, sorting and organizing with unconscious precision. When he reached for the next package, a familiar name caught his eye: Mrs. Thompson, Jane. A small smile touched his lips as he thought of her. It had been some time since he'd last seen the elderly woman, and the prospect of their interaction brought a spark of anticipation to his day. Memories of Mrs. Thompson's warm greetings and genuine interest in his life came to mind. In a job that could sometimes feel repetitive, she was a bright spot, a reminder of the human connections that made his work meaningful. Feeling energized, Darius climbed back into his van and headed toward Elm Street, where Mrs. Thompson's house awaited. As he approached her home, he noticed something unusual. The once tidy front yard now looked slightly overgrown, with weeds sprouting through the flower beds. The details seemed minor, but to someone who had observed the property regularly for years, it was noticeable. Shaking off the thought, Darius grabbed the package and walked up the front path. The warm concrete beneath his feet hinted at the summer sun's presence, but the house itself gave off an uninviting air. On the doorstep, a pile of newspapers lay untouched, some edges yellowed from exposure. Darius pressed the doorbell, its muffled chime echoing within. He waited, shifting his weight as the seconds stretched into a minute of silence. Frowning, he tried again, adding a firm knock this time. Still, there was no response. A faint unease settled over him. Mrs. Thompson was always prompt in answering the door, her absence feeling like an off-key note in a familiar tune. Sighing, Darius scribbled a note about the package and slipped it into the overflowing mailbox. The sight only deepened his concern. As he turned to leave, movement caught his eye. Mr. Jenkins, Mrs. Thompson's next-door neighbor, was watering his rose bushes. An idea sparked in Darius's mind as he raised a hand in greeting. "Good morning, Mr. Jenkins," Darius called out, walking toward the fence separating their properties. The older man squinted against the sun. "Morning, Darius. How's it going?" "I'm well, thanks," Darius replied before hesitating. "Have you seen Mrs. Thompson lately?" Mr. Jenkins frowned, his weathered face creasing in thought. "Now that you mention it, I haven't seen her in a while. Used to catch her in the garden every day, but it's been a couple of weeks at least." Darius felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "A couple of weeks," he echoed, forcing a smile to avoid alarming the man. "I'm sure it's nothing. Thanks for letting me know." Climbing back into his van, Darius sat for a moment, his hand resting on the wheel. The neighbor's words lingered in his mind. Mrs. Thompson's absence didn't sit right with him. As he continued his route, the image of her house remained in his rearview mirror, a silent, dark reminder that something wasn't as it should be. As Thompson Street vanished from his view, Darius couldn't shake the feeling of leaving something unresolved. Though his day ahead was packed with deliveries and routine tasks, his thoughts repeatedly circled back to the elderly woman. When lunchtime arrived, he found himself pulling into the parking lot of Mabel's diner, his regular lunch spot. The flickering neon sign, a beacon of comfort food and familiar faces, glowed faintly in the daylight. Typically, this midday break offered a welcome respite, a chance to reset and recharge. Yet today, the knot of worry in Darius's stomach only seemed to tighten as the hours dragged on. The cheerful jingle of the bell above the diner's door clashed with his somber mood. The aroma of coffee and grilled sandwiches filled the air, but for once, it failed to stir his appetite. "Hey there, Darius." Mabel greeted warmly from behind the counter, her round face lighting up with a smile. "The usuals?" Darius nodded absently, sliding onto his usual stool. "Thanks, Mabel." As she bustled off to prepare his order, his mind wandered back to Mrs. Thompson. The image of her overflowing mailbox lingered, an unsettling reminder of her prolonged absence. Try as he might, Darius couldn't shake the sense that something was terribly amiss. When Mabel set the steaming turkey club sandwich and fries before him, Darius barely noticed. Picking at the food, he replayed every detail of his earlier visit to Mrs. Thompson's house. She had always been a fixture in the neighborhood, a constant presence as reassuring as the rising sun. He thought of her warm greetings, the way her smile lit up her face, and her genuine interest in his day. Moments like the winter morning when she handed him a thermos of cocoa, or the spring day she showed him her blooming roses stood out vividly. Those small acts of kindness, brief yet meaningful, had often been highlights of his routine. Now, the thought of her being alone and possibly in danger gnawed at him. Mabel's gentle voice broke through his thoughts. "Everything all right, honey? You've hardly touched your food." Sighing, Darius ran a hand over his face. "I'm just worried about someone on my route, Mrs. Thompson, over on Elm Street. Have you seen her lately?" Frowning in thought, Mabel replied, "Jane Thompson? Now that you mention it, I haven't seen her at her usual Tuesday church lunches for a while. Is something wrong?" The confirmation deepened Darius's unease. As he explained the situation, Mabel's concern mirrored his own. "That doesn't sound like Jane," she murmured. "She's always been so active in the community. I feel like I should do something," Darius admitted. "But I'm not sure what." Mabel patted his hand gently. "You've got a good heart, Darius. Trust your instincts. If you think something's wrong, it probably is." Leaving the diner, Mabel's words echoed in his mind. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders. Mrs. Thompson had always been kind to him, always treated him with respect and warmth. He owed it to her to ensure she was safe. Determined, Darius returned to his postal van and started the engine. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across her yard as he pulled up for the second time that day. The house, now viewed in the harsher light, looked even more neglected than before. As Darius approached the front door, his heart raced. This time, he wouldn't leave without answers. Raising his hand to ring the bell, he noticed an unpleasant odor lingering in the air. He pressed the doorbell, its chime echoing faintly inside. After a moment of tense silence, he heard it, shuffling footsteps approaching the door. Relief mixed with concern as the door creaked open. What stood before him barely resembled the vibrant woman he once knew. Her silver hair was greasy and unkempt, her face pale and gaunt. But her eyes, once warm and intelligent, were now unfocused and glassy. "Mrs. Thompson," Darius said softly, masking his shock. "It's Darius, your mailman. Are you okay?" Blinking slowly, she mumbled, "Oh, Darius, dear. I'm fine, just under the weather." The sight of her stained and wrinkled clothing, combined with the state of her home, sent a chill through him. Trash was scattered across the floor, and the air was thick with a sickeningly sweet odor. "Mrs. Thompson," Darius said gently, his voice steady, "you don't look well. Is there someone I can call for you? A family member? A doctor?" She waved her hand dismissively.
No.
"I just need rest," she insisted, her words slurring slightly as she swayed on her feet. When she moved to close the door, the brief glimpse inside had Darius frozen in place. The chaos within confirmed what he feared. Something was terribly wrong. Back in his van, Darius gripped the steering wheel, wrestling with his thoughts. Respecting her privacy clashed with the undeniable evidence before him. Yet he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't ignore his instincts any longer. She clearly needed help, even if she couldn't or wouldn't admit it. Taking a deep breath, Darius resolved he couldn't let things remain as they were. Even if it meant overstepping boundaries or risking Mrs. Thompson's anger, he had to try again. He owed her that much. Stepping out of the van, Darius made his way back to Mrs. Thompson's front door, each step firm with determination. When he rang the bell this time, the silence that followed seemed even more foreboding. He stood there, counting seconds in his head, before pressing the button again. Still, there was no response. "Mrs. Thompson," he called, his voice tinged with urgency. "It's Darius again. Please, I just want to make sure you're okay." The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sounds of a lawnmower and children playing down the street. The normalcy of those sounds felt jarring against the growing dread tightening in Darius's chest. He knocked on the door, his fists striking the wood in sharp echoes across the quiet afternoon. "Mrs. Thompson, if you can hear me, please open the door. I'm worried about you," he pleaded, his anxiety mounting with each passing second. She had been there earlier. Why wasn't she responding now? Had something happened in the short time since he'd last seen her? His thoughts spiraled, each possibility more alarming than the last. Had she fallen or lost consciousness? The red stains on her clothing now seemed more sinister. What if she was bleeding and in desperate need of medical attention? Darius stepped back from the door, his heart pounding. He felt trapped. He wasn't family, so he had no legal right to enter her home, but leaving her alone felt equally impossible. With trembling hands, he pulled out his phone and stared at it. His thumb hovered over the keypad as he debated making a call that could change everything. It could be an overreaction, a violation of Mrs. Thompson's privacy and trust, but it might also save her life. Taking a steadying breath, Darius finally dialed 911. As the phone rang, he silently prayed he was making the right decision. When the dispatcher answered, their calm, professional tone brought some measure of reassurance. 911, what's your emergency? They asked. Darius swallowed hard, his words tumbling out in a rush of urgency and concern. My name is Darius Durant. I'm a mailman, and I'm really worried about one of the residents on my route. Her name is Mrs. Thompson, Jane Thompson. She lives at 1247 Elm Street. I've been to her house twice today, and something's very wrong. He quickly recounted everything: the neglected yard, the overflowing mailbox, her disheveled appearance, the red stains on her clothing, and her failure to answer the door now. Relief mixed with apprehension as he relayed these details, thankful he was finally taking action but nervous about what might come next. The dispatcher assured him that officers would be sent immediately to perform a welfare check. An ambulance would also be dispatched, given the seriousness of the situation. Ending the call, Darius let out a shaky breath. There was no turning back now. He had set events in motion, and all he could do was wait. Darius sat on the curb, his mind racing with questions and fears about what lay ahead. The wail of sirens soon cut through the quiet air, growing louder as they neared Mrs. Thompson's street. Standing up, he watched as a police cruiser and ambulance pulled up in front of her house, their lights flashing. 2 officers stepped out of the cruiser, their expressions serious as they approached Darius. "Are you the one who called this in?" the taller officer asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Yes, sir," Darius replied, swallowing hard. "I'm Darius Durant, the mailman for this route. I'm the one who called about Mrs. Thompson." The officer nodded and pulled out a notepad. "Can you walk us through what you saw that made you concerned enough to call 911? Taking a deep breath, Darius recounted everything from the unkempt yard to her disheveled state earlier in the day. He explained how she insisted she was fine but clearly wasn't, and how she hadn't responded since. The officers exchanged a grave look before turning toward the house. "All right," the taller officer said. "We're going to check it out. You stay here." Darius watched as they approached the front door, anxiety twisting his stomach. One officer rang the bell while the other stood to the side, hand resting on his holster. After several long moments of silence, they began knocking loudly, identifying themselves as police and calling for Mrs. Thompson to respond. When no response came, they conferred briefly before preparing to force entry. The sound of splintering wood echoed as they breached the door, vanishing inside moments later. Darius held his breath, the minutes stretching endlessly as he waited, straining to hear any sound. Suddenly, a voice called out from within, urgent and commanding. "We need medical assistance in here now." The paramedics, who had been waiting nearby, rushed past Darius and into the house. The scene felt surreal, like something out of a TV drama instead of the quiet street he knew so well. The fluorescent lights at Mercy General Hospital cast a cold, unflattering glow over everything, intensifying the already clinical and impersonal atmosphere. Darius sat in a stiff plastic chair in the waiting area, his postal uniform wrinkled from a long day, his thoughts a storm of worry and uncertainty. He had arrived shortly after the ambulance, rushing through the remainder of his mail route at an unprecedented pace. Initially, the hospital staff hesitated to share any details with him since he wasn't family. Only after a paramedic from the scene vouched for him did they allow him to stay. Hours had now passed, and Darius remained without any updates. He observed nurses and doctors moving with purpose, their faces etched with professional urgency. Each time the emergency room doors swung open, he straightened up, hoping to hear something about Mrs. Thompson. Finally, a doctor wearing scrubs approached him, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Durant," she asked, scanning the notes. Darius jumped to his feet, his heart pounding.
"Yes, that's me."
"How is Mrs. Thompson? Is she going to be okay?" The doctor's expression was somber as she gestured for him to sit down. She joined him, speaking in a low, serious tone. "Mr. Durant, I understand you were the one who found Mrs. Thompson and called for help. Your actions very likely saved her life. However, her condition remains critical." Darius felt a lump forming in his throat. How bad is it?" he asked, his voice trembling. The doctor sighed, choosing her words carefully. "Mrs. Thompson is severely dehydrated and malnourished. Additionally, she has advanced cancer. We're doing all we can, but given her age and the progression of her condition, her prognosis is uncertain." The clinical nature of the explanation hit Darius like a physical blow. He had suspected things were serious, but hearing it laid out so starkly made it all the more real. "I don't understand," he whispered. "How could it get this bad? Didn't anyone know she needed help?" The doctor's expression softened slightly. "From what we've pieced together, Mrs. Thompson was recently discharged from another hospital. She was supposed to have home care, but she trailed off, frustration evident. Unfortunately, patients, especially elderly ones without family, sometimes slip through the cracks in the system." Anger flared within Darius, mingling with his worry. "That's unacceptable. There has to be something in place to prevent this." "You're right," The doctor agreed with a resigned sigh. But the reality is far from perfect. Overworked social workers, understaffed facilities, insurance issues. These factors often lead to situations like this. As the doctor explained the treatment plan, Darius found his thoughts drifting. He recalled delivering mail to Mrs. Thompson's house, oblivious to the crisis brewing behind her closed door. Guilt threatened to overwhelm him, but a growing determination took its place. "Can I see her?" he asked abruptly, cutting the doctor off mid-sentence. The doctor hesitated. "She's heavily sedated, and visiting hours are almost over." But she studied his face and, moved by something she saw, nodded. "I suppose we can make an exception. Follow me." Darius steeled himself as they walked through the winding corridors, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight of Mrs. Thompson in her hospital bed. The once vibrant woman was now frail, her body connected to a maze of tubes and monitors. The rhythmic beeping of machines and the hiss of oxygen filled the room. Approaching cautiously, Darius gently took her hand. Her skin was cool and paper-thin. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Thompson," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have realized something was wrong sooner. I should have done more." As he stood there, consumed by guilt, he noticed a faint movement. Mrs. Thompson's fingers twitched, and her eyelids fluttered. Darius's heart leapt. "Mrs. Thompson," he said softly. "It's Darius, your mailman. You're in the hospital. You're safe now." Her eyes opened slowly, confusion giving way to recognition. "Darius," she croaked, her voice weak. What happened?" Darius pressed the nurse call button and turned back to her. "You've been very ill, Mrs. Thompson, but you're getting better. The doctors are taking good care of you." As medical staff arrived to tend to her, Darius stepped back, relief washing over him. Once assured that she was stable, he returned to her bedside. "They tell me you saved my life," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice stronger but tinged with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." Darius flushed. "I just did what anyone would do." "Not everyone would have noticed," she replied with a sad smile. Over the next hour, she shared her story between sips of water and pauses for breath. Diagnosed with cancer months ago, she had fought hard against the disease, only to be sent home due to overcrowding and insurance limitations. Too weak and too proud to ask for help, she had deteriorated alone. "You're not a burden, Mrs. Thompson," Darius said firmly. "You should never have been left to face this alone." Tears welled in her eyes as she grasped his hand. "Thank you, Darius. You've given me hope." From that moment on, Darius made a silent vow she would never have to face another challenge alone. Together, they would fight not just for her recovery but for the compassion and humanity often overlooked in a system stretched thin.